Hiya, hiya, hiya. Welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I'm John Odom, one of your hosts, and I'm with my co-host Marky Mark Card. Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Hope folks out there are doing well too.
Oh, the folks out there are doing so well. Well, Mark, why don't you lead in the conversation this week and
I can do
let us
that.
know what you're talking about, and let's see where the conversation goes.
So, as we've talked a little bit about before, my background is in academia and more specifically international relations. Even more specifically than that, my specialty was international conflict theory. And this got me to thinking about military science fiction and strategy and trying to kind of look and see if there are any terrestrial kind of parallels to something you might see in science fiction. And, in the past, you talk about fascism and Starship Troopers and the difficulties of following charismatic leaders in Dune. And so, since this show has to at least touch on Star Trek in every episode at some point, I thought I would apply that background to Star Trek.
Then just go with it, right? Just throw in the towel possibly and say, well, if we're going to talk about Star Trek anyways, let's just talk about Star Trek. I get it. I get it.
So what I want to do is when I sat down, when I was thinking about doing this podcast, I sat down and thought about what could operation strategy possibly be? And there are lots of different theoretical strategies about how you do things. The two basic ones are you a land-based strategy or are you a sea-based strategy? And obviously, what we're going to have to do is make some kind of comparison to an earthly strategy and see if it works for the Federation or not. What
Now, you're
immediately
using
came
the
to mind,
word strategy, but you should define it for folks. What do you mean by strategy?
okay, so to understand strategy, a lot of people don't understand the difference between strategy and tactics.
Hmm.
So the easiest way to understand this difference is tactics is you're about to have a battle. What's your plan for winning the battle? So those are the decisions that commanders on the ground, or in this case, commanders in space, have to decide what are they going to do to defeat the enemy. So, you've got the Picard maneuver. You've got other kinds of maneuvers that you see in Star Trek. That's tactics. This is not strategy. Strategy is how do you get to the place where you can fight a battle in the first place? What are the general kinds of conditions that you're going to impose on winning the war or establishing your political goals? So think of this in terms of video gaming. So you're going to play a video game and you're going to have a big picture kind of focus on what you're going to do in a military game. And then you'll flash forward to a smaller kind of situation where you have to deal with a battle that you've already set up and gotten into. So strategy is how do you get to the point to where you have to develop tactics? Is that
Hmm.
clear enough for you?
Yeah, I think so. And so obviously, or maybe not so obviously,
So as
we're talking about the Federation or Starfleet rather, to distinguish it from the Federation. They are distinct entities. They were talking about probably more about Starfleet, but not necessarily. But also, as Starfleet plays two roles in the Star Trek universe, one military and one scientific and exploration. So we're going to be, I suppose, the direction of least resistance is going to be to talk about Starfleet as a military entity, but obviously there's a lot of places we could go with any of the other combinations.
Sure. And what we're going to see in the example that I give you is that there's kind of a merging of the two. And so when I sat down to look at kind of classical strategy, the one that seemed the best parallel to Starfleet is a very important book written in the 19th century by an American admiral named A.T. Mahan. So A.T. Milne wrote this book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And what he wanted to do was, you have to understand the roots of him writing this book. He wanted to write this book to spur American policy, to change American naval policy. He saw that the American economy was beginning to stagnate.
Hmm.
And part of the reason why it was beginning to stagnate is because of the earlier strategy that the founding fathers established, which was, we're not going to get involved in European clashes. We're going to stay over here in North America and not get involved in foreign wars, at least not outside the Western Hemisphere. And he begins to see that, hey, this isn't going to work in the long term for the United States. So he does a historical study of all the powers in the past, all of the big empires of the past. And he finds that the biggest empires of the past all had a very strong naval strategy. And even if you look at somebody like Napoleon or Russia, and they're going to base their strategy on land forces. But he says, if you look at the history of these countries, they're just not going to be as successful as countries which employ a naval strategy. So what he wanted to do was, he said, there are three things that are most important in terms of developing a naval strategy. He said, you got to have production, you got to have shipping, and you've got to have an economy that needs expansion.
Hmm.
So I said, these are the basic conditions that you have to have in order for your economy and therefore your political system to kind of be successful. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the 6 different elements of sea power and just give you a basic definition. And then what I thought we would do is, and we'll see if you can agree, we'll look at the Federation, or more specifically, Starfleet, and see how these match up to see if this idea is kind of a good analysis of what Starfleet does. So I'm going to
We
do these
run into a
quickly.
problem right away, though, with at least with those definitions, but I assume we're not gonna feel trapped by them. And
No,
that's
I don't think so. No, I don't think it's going to set the,
Mhm.
I think
Because
there will be a,
economy, that means a whole different thing in the Star Trek universe in the Federation.
what I really meant to say was not economy. I read my poor handwriting.
Ah,
It's production, shipping, and colonies. And colonies. So production, shipping, and economies. I mean, and colonies. So colonies, in the basic sense, aren't just necessarily economic in this strategy. And we'll talk about that in a second. Let me go through these 6 points quickly, and then we'll talk about what the strategy is. So these 6 things are, how do you get to sea power? What are the conditions you have to be able to employ a naval strategy? Then I'll quickly talk about what the naval strategy is. So the first thing is, obviously you have to have some kind of geographical position which helps lead you to a navy. If you're a landlocked country, you can't employ this strategy, obviously. The problem is here, how do we expand that to a galactic kind of context?
right, where
Right?
nobody is landlocked.
That's right. Nobody's landlocked. But the point that they're trying to make is, you have to have kind of, I'm not sure exactly how this would work, but if you look at it, it says, look, if you're a landlocked country, you don't have any choice but to operate a landlocked based strategy. Um, but you have some real disadvantages. You can't, you're close to your enemies, and it's difficult to concentrate your forces. So if you got a big border and you're surrounded by a whole bunch of other land powers, then you're threatened by all these land powers. If you're a country like Britain or the United States, you're surrounded by ocean. So you can concentrate your forces where you're needed to defend yourself, but you can expand your forces where you want to do those 3 things: production, shipping, and colonies. We'll
Yeah,
go
but
through all
that's
these.
all we're talking about, right? Because there are no, like I said, nobody's landlocked in
That's
the
right.
Star Trek universe.
That's
they've all got the same type of coastline. But the question is, do they exist within this um, sort of cosmic NATO, which is actually a terrible comparison to the Federation. But
Yeah.
anyways, this organization or not, which is going to
Well,
limit their exposure.
you might think about this in terms of quadrants. Are you in a quadrant which is full of other people that are close by, or do you have some space between your rivals?
Mhm.
So if you're in a quadrant where there are no or very few other powers that threaten you, then you might be more of a physical, you might be more geographically disposed to expansion out into the rest of the galaxy.
Mhm.
See what I'm saying? So
Sure.
that's one way. The second thing you got to have is, and these are going to be hard to translate. We might have to do a little shifting here, but the second element of sea power that Mayan talks about is physical conformation. So, what kind of border to the sea do you have? Is it short? Is it long? Do you have, oh, let's look at a country like Belgium. Belgium has a big bunch of access to the sea, but what they're lacking is deep water ports.
Mhm.
So they don't have a place where they can construct ships very easily, and they don't have ports where they can operate a navy out of.
Mhm.
So you never have a giant Belgian navy. Just a little bit to the north, you've got Holland, and Holland only has a slightly larger coastline than Belgium, but they've got several deep water ports, so they can do that. Now, that's a tricky one to kind of put out there for um, the Federation. But the Federation, you could argue that Starfleet has solved a lot of these problems because they are actually constructing and operating the vessels out in space to begin with.
Mhm. Yeah, which is just speaks to the fact that and this maybe complicates and simplifies it, that every entity out there, every political entity has the exact same shoreline. They all have a spherical, all the way around. They all working from an exposed ball
Yes.
from the medium they're in, which is space rather than water. So that may simplify things, but it may complicate things when you start talking not at the individual world level, but at the level of the complete entity known as the Federation.
Right.
Because then, how many planets have you got versus the Klingons? How many planets have they got? So, how much shoreline do they have versus how much shoreline do we
Well,
have?
and that is a really great segue into the third element of this kind of strategy, which is extent of territory.
Hmm.
If you have a big territory and there's lots of coastline and you have lots of deep water ports, you're going to be more likely to engage in space travel than if you don't. But you could be like the Bajorans. The early Bajoran history was to expand out into space
Hmm.
and to do it without warp drive. And so they had a small territory, though they had a relatively larger territory. But then when the Bajorans, when they don't have a nearby rival, when their territory is clear and it's fairly large, they're exploring space, and they're exploring a pretty big chunk of space. When the Cardassians occupy them, they turn inward and they stop exploring space.
Hmm.
And so extent of territory also includes not just how big your coastline is, but how many other rivals do you have within your coastline?
Hmm. And I mean, the scale of coastline between expanding non-warp versus warp makes it is such a difference that it makes it almost irrelevant expanding without warp drive in comparison.
Right. Yeah. Okay. The next one is, this one makes sense. There's a direct corollary here to from going from Earth naval strategy to the galactic strategy, and that's the size of your population.
Hmm.
The bigger your population, the more likely you're going, and especially when they talk about reserves, naval powers have to rely not only on their frontline naval forces, they have to have large reserves, not only to actively participate in a naval strategy, but to do all those other economic activities which support a naval strategy. So you have to have a large population with lots of reserves. Having a big coast and lots of ports and long coastlines isn't enough. You have to have a large population, not just to support the Navy itself, but all of the other industries which are involved in production and maintenance and finance of the Navy. You got a little population, you can't do that. You got a big population, you can. And, this kind of is what happens with the Federation. When it's just Earth, we make first contact with the Vulcans, but having contact with the Vulcans isn't enough. You've got to, we find that with the Romulans starting to encroach on our part of the galaxy, you've got to have allies.
Mm-hmm.
So population, this one makes sense. The bigger your population, the more likely you're going to engage in a galactic strategy like Starfleet does. The fifth one is national character. Look, if your country has a big coastline and lots of ports and it has the population size, it has everything else, if your people aren't interested in exploration, if they aren't interested in colonization, if they aren't interested in trade, you're not going to have a naval strategy. Right. So if your civilization is not interested in contact with other beings in your quadrant, if you don't want to have cultural or economic exchange with the other neighbors, you're just not going to follow a naval strategy. So if you want to have a big Starfleet, then people have to be interested in that kind of exploration. Mm-hmm. And this one makes sense. And I think it makes sense when you apply it to Starfleet.
And we run into plenty of planets that are unaffiliated.
That's true.
I mean,
and who don't want affiliation.
Right. So that's another example. The Federation may be friendly with them, but or not.
Right.
And then, of course, you have pirates. You have the Orions, which I have to say, I've learned. This is a side thing, I know, but I've learned to be nicer to Orions. Thanks to Tandy. All right, in Lower Decks, who I think in the crossover made us give us all a lesson that not all Orions are pirates. They have scientific interest in vessels too. So anyways, so I don't want to pick on the Orions. I've learned not to. I've learned not to generalize an entire species, which, may I say, Star Trek does way too much. So
a lot.
Refreshing. Okay.
That's right. Anyway, and especially the original series.
Yeah. Well, I would say even later with the way the Klingons were, well, the same with the original. Yeah, you're right. Well, anyways, sorry I sidebarred there. I just went off. I heard myself calling all Orions pirates, and this is not the time to do that after the last couple seasons of Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks. So there you go. I'm an enlightened Trekkie.
Anyway. Even though Trek itself is not necessarily that enlightened, as we've already covered in previous episodes.
Oh, it gets more so all the time.
Oh no, I agree.
As in this example. So
the last one is character of government. And what Mahon says here is that certain kinds of governments are more likely to provide the infrastructure necessary for a naval/galactic strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what he says is that republics and democracies are more likely to follow a sustained, stable commitment to the production, the finance, and the maintenance of a naval strategy. And I think that fits with Starfleet. Starfleet is generally it's a federation. So they're going to have lots of like-minded members who are interested in the exploration of space and the exposure to other colonies. And you have to say there are commercial interests involved in Star Trek as well.
Well, there's exchanges of resources. They're not necessarily specifically commercially motivated, I guess I should say. They're more altruistically motivated.
Well,
And I'm making some
they're
assumptions here.
not motivated by profit,
Right,
but they are motivated by commercial enterprise
right.
to add
You
upon.
you get
So,
that
so
pure profit level when you get out near the fringes, when you run into the Ferengi,
yes,
where there is a more traditional currency of the latinum going on, and hoarding it becomes more of a motivation.
and you will note that the Ferengi are not as exploration minded, except for that profit.
Right, right.
And so they're not really interested necessarily in other cultural exchange. They want to dominate and colonize for profit.
Hmm.
And you talk about the Ferengi laws of acquisition. One that we never heard, which I think should be added, and I don't know what number they would be. It would be that peace is profitable, war is costly.
I wonder if that exists. There are so many laws. I can't remember. I'm really
I've
bad.
looked up all the ones they've mentioned, and that is not one, but it most definitely needs to be one.
Uh-huh.
That peace is profitable and war is costly. So anyway, this basically says what kind of government do you have? Because if the government is not interested in expanding out and discovering new cultures and providing some kind of commercial interest, even if it's not purely profit driven, you're just not going to do it. It's not going to be a good strategy for you.
Mhm.
So, a good example of that is what's the name of the guys who acquire all this technology but don't really know how to use it?
We are smart,
Yes,
right? The
those
ones,
guys.
well, they end up endangering Geordi and themselves, I guess.
So these are the six basic kind of elements to sea power. If you follow all of them, this is going to be the kind of strategy that you deal with. We haven't really talked about what the strategy is.
Hmm.
So the interesting part about this strategy is it's not a military strategy first and foremost. It's an economic strategy.
Hang on, I just looked it up. It's the Packlids. What's wrong
That's
with me?
yeah,
God.
that's the Packlids. I couldn't remember it either. I'll chalk it
Oh,
up to age.
oh, that's bad. I'll chalk it up to age too. Ye gods.
The Packlids, yes.
Mhm. But
So
anyway, I
they
interrupted you, but I wanted
Okay.
to
So we
follow
haven't
along.
really we've talked about what the elements of this strategy are. We haven't really talked about what the strategy is first.
Hmm.
What the actual strategy is, he says. So man, his understanding of strategy is not a military strategy. It's first and foremost an economic strategy. So if you're a country that fits all six of these characteristics, you are going to explore the oceans.
Hmm.
Those conditions necessitate that not only is this your best option, it's probably your only option for strategy.
Hmm.
And it's based primarily on economic activity. So you don't have a fleet to attack your enemies. Your military fleet is going to be tiny compared to your commercial fleet.
Right. And by commerce in this context, I think we have a unique situation here where we're not talking about the exchange of currency. We're talking about the exchange of ideas and technology in order to enhance the
Right.
collective entity, which
But
is the
we're,
Federation.
but we're,
But you
but
could
we're
still define that as an economy, which it's just interesting.
Well, and the reason why it's defined as an economy is because it requires resources.
Hmm.
You've got to have dilithium for space exploration.
Hmm.
You've got to mine certain things that you need to create these new technologies.
Hmm.
And so the idea is you have this massive commercial fleet, and the only purpose of a military fleet is to protect your commercial interests. So, in addition to that, so if you're going to have this big commercial fleet to protect your economy and your ideals, your political economy, your values, then you have to have a military fleet to protect your commercial fleet.
Hmm.
In addition, you have to have what I would call colonies. Now, in the Federation's case, this is not a colony built on submission of that culture to the Federation culture necessarily.
Right.
You're not trying to dominate and steal all the resources like you do with earthly colonization. It's more establishing things like mining colonies and star bases
Hmm.
so you can refit and refuel and give your crew some shore leave.
Hmm.
And so you can disperse information and resources and ideas. So your military fleet is also designed not just to protect the commercial things, but in the 19th century, they said you've got to have coaling stations, places where the ships can refit and refuel. So this is not necessarily just a strategy of cultural or political domination. It's about the use of resources. And I
Hmm.
think that part fits really well with how the Starfleet is set up.
Now, of course, and I'm sure you're getting to this, but then the dynamics change when you're surrounded by entities that have more traditional desire to collect resources for a traditional economy, for a traditional currency, and are aggressive. Some
Or
of them,
or
anyways. We
or
have
for
the
national
Romulans and the Klingons, which call themselves empires. So who are we to question that? And but we have treaties with both. We have the Strange New Worlds version of the Gorn, which are very aggressive. I mean, we have um, we have some other folks who, like the Tholians, who are also problematic, but they're not necessarily expansionist. But anyways, you're squeezed on all sides, especially coreward, from these other entities that may have an interest in taking what you got on a more traditional definition.
and a lot of that. I mean, if you look at the Klingons, that's for religious purposes.
Oh, I suppose it kind of is.
The entire Klingon mythos is built on empire, power, glory, war.
Hmm.
And so their national character is different. But what Mayan might say is that because they're an empire, a dictatorship, a divine right monarchy, they are less likely to succeed. And if you look at Star Trek, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah. I mean, they play with that a little bit, but that's because it's sci-fi. And
Right.
sci-fi, not everybody's equal.
That's
You
true.
you
Now,
have the
what I think is
Dominion
interesting
War,
is
and you have
a
to.
lot of this goes to hell in a handbasket when the Dominion threatens the Federation.
Right, right. And
A
that's
lot of
exactly
it.
what I was talking about and thinking about, where they have to make uh, a lot of alliances. In one particular case, they do it in a very un-Star Trek way, but that's another whole episode.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a lot more Section 31 kind of business, what you're talking about.
right.
Now, what's interesting to me though is that one of the things that Mahan talks about in this book is that this strategy naturally leads to the acquisition of allies.
Oh, that's a neat idea.
And the reason why it does is you're going to find other people that have the same interests and commercial kinds of expansion that will help you protect your commercial empire because they're doing the same thing.
Yeah, or in the case of the Dominion War, it's existential, not academic or
That's correct.
this is
That's
economic.
existential. So you will naturally seek allies if you're going to use this strategy because you have so many other more cultural, economic, and other kinds of intersections with these people as a natural part of your economic strategy. So
Mhm.
what I think is interesting here, and I think one of the best things about comparing Starfleet and the Federation to this strategy is that it's not just military strategy, it's a military and political economy strategy.
Mhm.
And so your internal dynamics of the expansion of your economy drives your foreign policy, but it's not necessarily going to be in a confrontational kind of way.
Sure.
And I think that because the Starfleet has settled some of the economic questions about sharing scarce resources, it becomes a natural extension of their strategy.
Can I just say I have a sneaking feeling, and I have no reason to know this for sure, but when we have our friend Lee McKagan back on to talk about imperialism
Oh
in
yeah.
Star Trek, I have a feeling she's going to turn a lot of this on its head, and I can't
Yeah,
wait.
I think she's going to talk a lot about cultural imperialism.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I wonder, but anyways, that's a preview there. That's the trailer.
Yeah, I
Uh,
can't wait for her to listen to this. This is going to be great. But I think it's one, I think it's a good kind of understanding about it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Gene Roddenberry in the Navy?
I think he was in the Air Force. I might be wrong about that. I'm gonna look
Let's,
that up. I
I'm going
want
to
to
look it up
know. I
too.
should know that.
Let's see what we can find here.
That's right. We have the Google, and
Yes,
I always have access to it. Near-death experience in the Pacific War. Looks like he was a
he was in the Air Force. He flew 89 combat missions with the 394th Bomb Squadron.
bomb squadron. Yep, yep, yep.
He was a
Okay.
B-17 pilot. So technically, he was part of the Army because back then it was the Army Air Corps.
Nothing could stop the Army Air Corps.
But what was the strategy they used?
Blow shit up.
It was all naval.
Oh, blow shit up from the water.
Yep. So,
Wasn't
so
all naval. There were
of
those
course it
big
was.
bombing runs.
What did you have to do?
It was air. There was a lot of air power going on
Hang,
in that war.
hang on. But what did you have to do to be able to reach Japan?
No, or I'm thinking Germany, honestly.
I'm thinking the Pacific, which was a
Mhm.
much wider war. It was a totally naval strategy.
Yes, yes, that
And the
totally.
reason why is Japan had a big coastline.
Hmm.
Japan had lots of harbors.
Hmm.
Japan had lots of colonies. Japan had lots of commercial interests. And it might be interesting to see, we talk about Lee McKagan. Uh, yeah, what's one of the reasons why Japan declared war on the United States? Well, we shut off their access to a whole bunch of resources.
Hmm.
So you're talking about a clash of colonial powers.
Yep. But I suppose we digress. However, we are getting to the end of our time here. You want to throw in some last minute thoughts on this?
It's kind of interesting. It just seems to me like a natural extension of the Starfleet idea. But I mean, that makes sense. I mean, if you look at Starfleet as it was set up, it's a naval model.
Hmm.
Everything they talk about, the
Absolutely.
bridge, the galley, the
Hmm.
brig, all of that stuff it's all based on Navy. And it was intentionally done that way. So I'm sure this wasn't, specific, but it just seems like a natural extension of that. And then once you talk about how the Federation has solved its economic problems, then you're talking about a different kind of uh, colonialism. You're talking about colonialism based on shared ideas and shared values.
Right. Well, anyways, this has been a lot of fun.
Well, thanks for indulging me, and
Absolutely.
I'll try to keep introducing my background to look at some of these ideas.
Absolutely. It's why we have you here, by God. All right. So thanks for listening, folks. We'll,
Yes, thank you.
yeah, we'll talk to you next time, which I don't know what we're going to talk to you about, but it'll be something cool. See ya. Our theme music is by Christopher Piatek.